Hello everyone, and welcome back to the good stuff. And by the good stuff I mean Game 7 of the 1972 World Chess Championship match between Boris Spassky and Robert James Fischer. Now, if you've been following the Bobby Fischer story so far, you know that he won the interzonal tournament in Palma de Mallorca in 1970. Then he continued to win the candidates matches against Taimanov, Larsen, and Petrosian, lastly in Buenos Aires. Now he faces Boris Spassky. He lost the first two games. First one he lost due to that blunder of the bishop. Well, okay, he could have perhaps saved it later, but doesn't really matter. Game 2 he lost because he didn't show up, and then out of the 4 next games he won 3.5 points out of 4. So only one draw for Spassky, and 3 games were won by Fischer. So this is Game 7, and even though the result is only 3.5 to 2.5 in Fischer's favor, the important part is that out of the 4 previous games, Fischer took 3.5 points. So Spassky really has to do something about this, hence the quote above the board, as this is Spassky's own opinion about this game. So we left it off at Game 7. Spassky applauded his opponent on the brilliant victory, and Fischer, of course, as usual, celebrates alone. This time he went bowling up until 5 a.m. And there's a very interesting story about the beginning of the 7th game. Spassky said that if Fischer has such a nice and fancy chair, that he would also enjoy a fancy chair. So they had a chair flown over from New York. It was a very fancy chair. It costed almost $500, some $470, and now Spassky could swivel in his chair, as Fischer did very often. And one Fischer fan didn't really think that it could have a negative psychological effect on Fischer. So this Fischer's fan stole the chair that was specially delivered for Spassky, and he hid it. But fortunately for Spassky, the chief arbiter Lothar Schmidt was able to recover it, and the chair was placed for Spassky to sit in before Game 7 started. So all is well, and this time after... even though Spassky used e4 in his 1979 World Chess Championship match against Dick Petrosian, last time he used it against Fischer was some 12 years ago. So here we have e4 by Spassky, and he said that due to the fact that he lost out of the previous 4 games 3.5 points, he can't keep avoiding Fischer's pet line against e4, and now he really wants to fight. So Fischer replies c5, and of course we will have a Najdorf on the board, as for over a decade Fischer was considered the top authority on the Najdorf. Knight to f3, d6, d4, c captures, knight captures, knight to f6, knight to c3, and a6. We do have the Najdorf on the board, and Spassky allows Fischer to go for his pet line. Spassky chooses the sharpest move, bishop to g5. E6, we have f4, and here it is, queen to b6. Fischer goes for the poisoned pawn variation. It really doesn't get any better than this. Last person to allow Fischer to go for this queen to b6 poisoned pawn variation was Parma in the Tournament of Peace that was played in Rovinj, Zagreb in 1970, and Fischer won that game very nicely, excellently, if I do say so. Queen to d2, of course Spassky offers the b2 pawn, queen captures, and now knight to b3. This is the first time someone actually plays knight to b3 against Fischer. The idea is pawn to a3 and then trapping the queen with rook to a2. So there are several ways you can counter this. Fischer immediately gets the queen out of this trap, and here we have bishop to d3. Fischer simply continues. We have bishop to e7, Spassky castles, and now h6, asking Spassky, what do you want to do with this bishop? So if you capture on f6, for example, bishop captures, and now e5, d captures on e5, and after knight to e4, yeah, it seems like white is building up some sort of an attack, but after knight to c6, it's very hard to find a way for white to actually continue the attack. So after h6, Spassky decides to sacrifice a pawn. We have bishop to h4, offering the e4 pawn, and Fischer grabs it. We have knight captures on e4, now opening a discovered attack against this bishop. Knight captures on e4, and now bishop captures on h4. And here, a lot of different ideas do seem possible. For example, we have to check out the option of this very interesting knight captures on d6. For example, if you play this, knight captures on d6, queen captures on d6, and now if you're hoping to win the queen with bishop to b5 check, because you've opened up a discovered attack towards black's queen, king to e7 simply defends the queen. Your queen is now under attack, the bishop is under attack on b5, and white will just feel silly for sacrificing the knight on d6. On the other hand, one option that Spassky, as he did definitely prepare this line, he did check out the bishop to b5 move. But then after a captures on b5, yes, now you can start the attack with knight captures on d6, as now the queen is already guarding the knight. But now after king to e7, as now the rook is guarding the bishop, if you go to f8, then knight can capture bishop. Knight captures on b5, attacking the queen. And now you have to go queen to a6 to prevent the queen from checking the king on d6. So the queen is now guarding the d6 square, but now comes queen to b4 check. And after king to d8, rook does come to d1 with check, but now knight to d7, and it seems that black defended successfully. So although it is a very fierce attack, Spassky doesn't feel like it's worth going for. So first he plays f5. He sacrifices yet another pawn to perhaps make this attack happen just a little bit faster. And Fischer doesn't mind. He grabs yet another pawn. He captures on f5. And now, if you try something like queen to f4 and say that, okay, if f captures on e4, I can capture on f7. Also, I'm attacking your bishop on h4, simply bishop to e7. And you have to do something about this knight. Black will safely castle, and all is well for Fischer. So after this e captures on f5, and now Spassky says that now it's a completely different story, that we've opened up the e file. Now bishop to b5 is definitely a thing. And he does play it, but Fischer simply captures the bishop. A captures on b5. Fischer takes everything Spassky offers him. We have knight to d6 check, and here comes Fischer's brilliant defensive idea. Now the same idea, king to e7, doesn't really work for black, as now the e file is open. Now you can actually capture on b5. Knight captures on b5, and after queen to a6, queen to b4 check. Similar as in the previous variation, but after king to f6 now, queen captures on h4. This comes with check, and now g5 doesn't really do anything for you, as queen can remaneuver to d4 with check. So here king to g6, and now after a4 defending the knight, you would win the piece back. And with black being so underdeveloped, it would be a very hard position to hold for black. So instead, after this knight to d6 check, Fischer doesn't go king to e7 and guards the bishop with the rook. Rather, he plays king to f8. He allows Spassky to capture the bishop, the piece back, and he offers Spassky to go for a worse endgame. And after considering what to do here, ideas like rook a to e1, if you just happily continue sacrificing, doesn't really work. Yes, you do have the threat, rook to e8, but simply bishop captures, rook captures, and now bishop to e6, blocking off the rook's path to e8, and black is completely winning now. So Spassky doesn't find a better move. He has to go for this slightly worse endgame. Knight captures on c8. And now Fischer simply plays knight to c6. A nice developing move, opens up an attack against Spassky's knight, and there really isn't a way for Spassky to actually continue this attack. Although, for the moment, Fischer's king is slightly odd on f8, and it will take him some time to play g6, king to g7, and bring the other rook into the game, but there's no way for Spassky to actually prevent this. So it seems Fischer defended, it's only move 17, and again, it seems that it will be Fischer who will be playing for the win in game 7. We have knight back to d6. Spassky has to bring the knight back to safety. Rook to d8, pinning the knight. Also, this comes with a double attack on the knight, and now comes knight captures on b5. Here, Spassky actually wouldn't mind if Fischer captures the queen. For example, rook captures, queen captures, knight captures queen on a3. The rook is under attack, rook to d5, and Spassky will try to hold this with the white pieces. But Fischer isn't interested in a queen trade. He goes queen back to e7. Spassky's queen is still under attack. We have queen to f4, attacking the bishop. G6, preparing king to g7, and bringing the rook into the game. And here we have a4 by Spassky. And here is the first moment where Fischer takes a better position and doesn't treat it as perhaps as carefully as he should have. But he did win 3.5 points out of the previous 4 games, so perhaps it made him a little bit hasty But he plays bishop to g5 here. There's always time for that. You don't have to rush anything. Better yet was king to g7 and then bring your rook into the game. And then black can play anything he wants. White doesn't have a way for pushing for anything here. And Fischer says that he was very unimpressed with how he played this game. But okay, bishop to g5 attacks Spassky's queen. Queen moves to c4. And now we have bishop to e3 check. King to h1 and now f4. A very unpleasant position for white, as this bishop and pawn on f4 are really preventing Spassky from using the rooks. But all of this was playable even if you first played king to g7, brought the other rook into the game, and then with all of your pieces developed, only then push for advantage, because for now you still have an undeveloped rook on h8. G3 by Spassky, a very nice move that hopes to break open these pawns. And now f captures on g3, although possible, you don't want to allow moves like rook a to e1. So instead Fischer simply plays g5, protects the f4 pawn. We have rook a to e1 by Spassky. Now the rooks are very nicely placed in the center of the board, and now comes queen to b4. Fischer offers a trade of queens, and he says that he will enjoy this superior ending and push for a win here. Queen captures on b4, we have knight captures on b4, and now comes rook to e2, defending the c2 pawn. And how does Fischer proceed here? Here, finally, Fischer plays king to g7. He prepares to bring the other rook into the game, but again, as he mentions later, a move like knight to c6 would have been much better. Black's only weakness here is the b7 pawn, and the way for white to attack it is knight to a5. So with knight to c6, you would prevent this, and black would have an easier game, and the white wouldn't really have a good move. As this bishop is really a monster here, controlling all of these dark squares. You can't play rook to d2 to confront black's rook on d8. Of course, you cannot go to d1 because nothing is guarding it on d1. It would be a very hard position to play for Spassky. But again, Fischer goes for king to g7, and now comes knight to a5. Immediately, Spassky goes after this pawn. b6, and now knight to c4. Again, attacking the pawn on b6, but also now attacking the bishop on e3. Knight to d5, guarding the pawn and the bishop. Knight c to d6, and now this knight on d6 is also a monster, so you do have to do something about this. Here Fischer decides to go after it. Bishop to c5, attacking the knight, and now we have knight to b7, attacking the bishop here. And here was most likely the most critical moment in the game, where Fischer can actually go for a win with a certain move. But feel free to pause the video here, and how would you treat this position? It doesn't win the game like instantly, but it's the way, definitely the way to go. It's what Gligorich mentions in his book, and Fischer also says that well, he was overall very unimpressed with his game. But yeah, feel free to pause the video here and give it your best. I'll give it a couple of seconds as usual. For those of you who were able to do it, congratulations, you are really an excellent endgame player. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, the idea is knight to e3. Your rook is under attack, yes, but you will also attack Spassky's rook. And now you have several options here. The most important thing is, if you move the rook, then f3 is coming. You can't block this, because rook to d1 will eventually result in checkmate. After you give up both rooks, then rook captures on f1 will be checkmate. On the other hand, after this knight to e3 move, you have to play something. If you play knight captures here, then simply knight captures on f1. Grabbing the rook back, and now your knight is attacked here. After you move it, knight to b7, f3 is coming, attacking the rook. You have to move the rook to e1. Now comes knight to e3, and now f2 and f1 wins the game. Last option after knight to e3 is moving the rook while still keeping control of the first rank. For example, rook to a1, but still f3 is coming. Rook to f2. Now first attacking the f3 pawn, but now g4 defending it, and now white will face a lot of nasty discoveries here if you don't grab the bishop. So knight captures on c5, b captures on c5, and after king to g1, rook h to e8, and now Fischer's position is definitely winning here. This was one such idea, but here Fischer instead goes for rook to c8. He moves his rook out of this very, very important open d file, and Spassky really makes use of this small leap of hope. c4. He attacks the knight on d5. Fischer plays knight to e3, but now it's a different story. Now knight to e3 is not so powerful, because here everything is the same, but now simply rook to f3. There is no more rook on d8 to deliver checkmate via rook to d1. We have knight captures on c4 by Fischer, but now comes pawn captures on f4. Pawn to g4, and now comes rook to d3. So Spassky was able to mess up Fischer's strong pawn structure. He had a very nice pawn chain here. Also, the pawn was ready to come to f3, and now Spassky controls the only two open files on the board. C file is also open, but there's a, it's pretty crowded there. So we have h5 by Fischer. H3 by Spassky, and now comes knight to a5, challenging the strong knight on b7. And this is already move 36, so we are reaching time control. It's very important that you that you reach it with a good position. We have knight to d6. Spassky avoids the trade on a5, and here we have bishop captures on d6. Knight captures on d6, and now as Fischer, with this maneuver, moving the knight to a5 and capturing on d6, Fischer opens up the third open file for his rook. So rook to c1, this comes with check. King to g2, and this is move 39. So both players need to make one more move to reach time control. It's Spassky's move. What do you play here? Sorry, it's Fischer's move first, and Fischer decides to go for knight to c4. So he says Spassky's knight on d6 is too strong of a piece. We have to trade it. And while it is possible to play something like knight to f5, Spassky instead goes for knight to e8. This comes with check, and here king to g6 is played. So this is the 40th move. Time control has been reached, and now Spassky has to make one more move to reach adjournment, and he has to decide which move he will seal, so they can analyze it over the course of the entire night. And here, after considering all of the possibilities, Spassky decides to go for h4. And he spent 45 minutes on h4 before actually sealing it, and this is where the game was adjourned, and now the players, of course, and their seconds were analyzing it. And this is something I will also mention. For example, a move like rook to d5 was also an idea, but then Spassky says that this isn't really a threat. Fischer will simply play f6, and everything is fine for black. But it's after this h4 move, everyone was very impressed with this move. Spassky really had to figure a lot of things out, as you'll see here. But it's something Nikolai Krogius, Spassky's second, mentions in his diary. Here it was. After the game was adjourned, it was really an intense battle of seconds. Like you had to analyze it 6 hours over the course of the entire night to be able to prepare for the game tomorrow. Because Fischer is still better here. h4 is a brilliant move, but black is still better, and Spassky really cannot afford to lose another game. And everyone was analyzing for the entire night to figure out the best continuations for white. But Krogius mentions that although Fischer did have a second, his second was William Lombardi, but Fischer always first analyzed it for himself, and only when he was finished analyzing himself, only then would he consult Lombardi for an opinion. Also, a very interesting piece of information. Here, Fischer goes f6 after it was continued tomorrow. If he goes for something like king to f5, this is also something Spassky had to see very nicely, and also why h4 was very important. h4 was very important because it covers g5. Now after knight to g7, Fischer would have to repeat moves. He would have to go back king to g6, because if he captures here, then of course you get rook to d4, and this is checkmate. You can see that all of the squares around the black king are covered, and the h4 pawn nicely covers the g5 square. So instead, after h4, Fischer goes for f6, and here we have rook to e6 with a double attack against the f6 pawn. Rook to c2 check. We have king to g1, and now comes king to f5. Now king to f5 is different. It will not result in black being checkmated because the king is now on g1. Also possible was, instead of this king to f5, a nice exchange sacrifice via rook captures on e8. Spassky and his team analyzed this thoroughly. Fischer also says that he analyzed it, and he didn't see that it leads to anything. But really you have to see that after rook captures, knight to d2. Now this knight is coming to f3, and it will be a very nice position for black. For example, rook to e2, knight to f3 with check, king moves, and now rook to c4, attacking both the f4 pawn and the a4 pawn. So you can't really allow black to capture either of these pawns. So you have to capture the knight. Rook captures, you give back the exchange. G captures, now comes king captures on f3, and now king to f5, attacking the f4 pawn. We have rook to b2, rook captures with check, king moves, rook to g4 check, king to h3, and now rook captures on a4. Rook captures on b6, and now the problem is this will be a draw in the end, as there's no way for black to actually break through here. If you try to move the king, rook here, king to g2, and you can't bring your king closer because you have to keep an eye on the f6 pawn. But yeah, a very important idea, and they really thought Fischer might go for this, so they spent a lot of time analyzing this. But there will be a link in the description below to the whole Nikolai Krogi's diary, so feel free to check it out. There are a ton more variations there for you to enjoy. I thought about including all of the ones he mentions, but it would really make like an hour of a video. But for those of you who are interested in some supreme vast knowledge, you know, feel free to go for it. King to f5 by Fischer. Now the same idea will not lead to checkmate, as we've already mentioned. Knight to g7 check. King can now capture on f4. There's no king on g2. Now comes rook to d4 check, and now Fischer brings his king over to g3. Seems like a very nice position for black. If Fischer can get one move, rook to c1 check, it could very well lead to checkmate. But Spassky had this whole position analyzed over the course of the entire night. Knight to f5 check was played. We have king to f3, and now comes rook e to e4. And now the important thing is that now rook to c1 will lead to king to h2, and there's really no way to push for anything with black here. Fischer did play rook to c1, king to h2 was played. After rook to c2 check, king to g1 was played, and it was in this position on move 49 that the players agreed to a draw. It's very interesting because Spassky spent so much time preparing that h4 move to seal. He only had like less than 20 minutes on the clock for the entire adjourned game until move 60, where another time control is reached. So here there's really no way to push for advantage. Even if Fischer tries to push for advantage, even he could get checkmated. For example, if you try something like rook g2 check, king moves, and now rook here to threaten checkmate, it would actually be Fischer who would get checkmated. For example, rook f4 check, king e2, knight to g3 check, king e3, rook f2 e4 check, king f3, rook to d3 check, knight to e3 blocking, and now rook d captures on e3 with checkmate. So of course, you know, that was nothing like this happened. After king to g1, they agreed to a draw, and here Spassky said that this is the first game where he showed his fighting spirit, and indeed challenging Fischer with e4 to play his favorite line, the poison pawn variation of the Sicilian. Truly an amazing line. This variation will be repeated once more in this match, and it will really be an amazing game, but we're gonna get back to that. So yeah, that's game 7. I do hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, a lot of useful links will be in the description below. Also, I will add a nice half an hour documentary also in the description below. It's called Chess: A State of Mind. Do check it out. It's really enjoyable, and check out all of the useful links. So yeah, I do hope you enjoyed it. I do hope you're enjoying the Bobby Fischer series so far, and I would like to thank John Armani, Marcello Andrade, Brian Calling, Alex Lascovi, and James Jeffrey for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, most likely with game 8 of this Spassky-Fischer match. Thank you all, and I'll see you soon.